Before I say anything, let me spend a few words to remember Judith Babayan. Judith wrote a very original, intriguing, and provocative book on the Italian resistance in Tuscany, where her take from another direction caused us to question some of the assumptions and some of the ways in which we had told, in which we had been told the story of the anti-fascist resistance in central Italy. And without being in any way revisionist in the sense of shifting sides, but she managed to question our own assumptions, and therefore gave us a wonderful contribution to the understanding. Good. All set? Okay, to the understanding of our own history. So I wish to thank Judith and the Australian oral history community for this invaluable contribution. Thank you. My talk today will be actually two separate talks, which is why I called it a twice-told tale. One is I will tell you the story of a life and analyze the story, and then raise a few questions about the interviewing process, memory, storytelling, and so on. And I would like to start by introducing you to Giuseppe Di Porto. I interviewed Giuseppe Di Porto in Rome in 2005. He was the uncle of a student of mine, and this young woman said, perhaps you'd be interested in talking to my uncle. He's an Auschwitz survivor, so I went. And this is a key passage from his interview, and I think we can also hear his voice.
On that.
Io mi ricordo correttamente che per 2 anni non uscivo da casa se non ci avevo perso 2 pezzi di pane in tasca. Ma anche se io ero sicuro, io a casa lascio 1 chilo di pane, esco e avevo la paura che c'avevo fame. E che facevo poi? No, a tornare io volevo comprare il pane. Però la malattia che c'avevo quel pezzo di 2 pezzi di pane mi dava la forza, la tranquillità mi dava, ecco, insomma.
Okay, bread is the key symbol of this narrative. Giuseppe Di Porto was born in Rome in 1923. He did not finish elementary school, and he began working with his father, who had a peddler's license that he had been granted because he was a World War I veteran, but he lost it after the Italian government passed the racist anti-Jewish laws in 1938. And they just made do with any way they could, but he remembers that his father gave him a teaching that stayed with him about work ethics, honesty, and just being an honest, a good, honest person and worker. 1942, a number of Jewish members of the Jewish community in Rome were forcibly recruited for forced labor on the banks of the river Tiber in Rome, and this is one of the first things that he mentions, and it has to do with work. In June 1942, I received this nice postcard in which they tell me that I'm so lucky that I have been chosen for compulsory labor. And I was sent to the Ponte Vittorio, the bridge on the river, and with a team, about 50 other Jews, we were supposed to shovel sand on the riverbed and throw it into the river. The shovel is another symbol in the story. So I went to interview him in his nice middle-class apartment in traditional neighborhood in Rome. As we were talking in his living dining room, his wife, also an Auschwitz survivor, was in a room next door, and she has never said a word. She's never spoken. And he even says, I didn't know anything about my wife's story except for what I had to find out for bureaucratic purposes, insurance, and everything. So after July 1943, when the fascist regime falls, Giuseppe Di Porto was able to get a job in Genoa, in northern Italy. On October 16th, the Jewish community in Rome was raided and 1,022 members were deported to Auschwitz. His own family managed to escape and survive, but he was taken in Genova in early early November 1943. So, and he is sent on to Auschwitz, and he is taken to the Monowitz section of the Auschwitz camp, which is an industrial plant in which Primo Levi, the author of Is This a Man, also worked. So, and the main theme of the story is how hungry he was all the time. And he says, I was always hungry, so I took chances, I took risks. I think in the camp, nobody ever dared get out of the barracks at night. I used to do it. I did it 4 or 5 times. Coming out at night meant an escape attempt, and you were killed on the spot immediately. But I did it 4 or 5 times to go to a pigsty. 30 meters away, there was a pigsty, and I go to steal a piece or 2 of bread, a bread as hard as rock, covered with green mold, with pig droppings on it. I would steal this piece of bread, take it to the barrack, and eat it. This is what hunger was, what hunger felt like. If you get a chance to talk to any deportee, ask him, tell me truthfully, would you have given your ration of bread to anyone, a friend, a brother, anyone? And this turns out to be the key question in his life story. So, and he prepares the telling of the heart of the crucial symbolic moment in many ways. First of all, he describes the impact that violence and starvation had on the body, but most of all on the soul of the deportees. He calls it demoralization, also in the literal sense of moral chaos, the unjust, the senseless death of innocent people, the unspeakable dehumanization of the victims themselves. The son stole bread from his father. There was no respect for people, he says. And then the unspeakable feelings of anger, of denial toward a God that does not exist. Twice he begins to recount, and it happened to me, and one day, but he feels that he still must explain so that I understand what he's talking about. And so he starts all over again. All of us were demoralized because we saw people die like this, people who never did anything wrong, and they had to die like this. At that point, I was saying to God, where are you? You don't exist. You can't exist. Then sincerely, I have to reconsider about many things, because in life, in the camp, I saw things that were miracles. And so it happened that I had been in the camp a couple of months, and I was blaspheming, blaming God. I kept saying, God doesn't exist. And one day, hunger. The son was stealing bread from the father. There was no respect. People were stealing from hunger. They were stealing. They were doing actions, things caused by hunger. And then a ration of bread was life. This is where he was getting at. Bread was life, literally and symbolically. Bread, in the Psalms we read, bread sustains the hearts of the monsters. Bread and wine are the seeds of sacredness, of holiness, enshrines in ritual gestures, such as the sanctification of wine at Kiddush, and of course the ceremony of communion. Now that he has found the formula, bread was life, that contains the meaning of everything, he can finally go on and tell the story. And he begins by describing an island of abnormal near-normality in this absurd universe of death and fury. It was a Sunday, and there was no work. I avoided meeting any other Italians so that I wouldn't feel even more demoralized. And as I was walking about on my own business, I ran into this guy, Mario Piperno, who he died a couple of years ago, poor man in Rome. He had been suffering so much. So we knew each other by sight. And I'm walking like this on my own business, and I run into this guy, Mario Piperno. And I said, hi, Mario, where are you going? And he says, I just passed the physical. They told me to go to the hospital because I have diarrhea. So I get to stay 3 or 4 days in the infirmary, stay warm, not work. I said, well, good luck, bye-bye. And he says, do me a favor. Now, you know, when you go into the infirmary, they take away your spoon. They take away your mess tin. Now, the mess tin was like a big bowl where you put the soup in, and then you had to eat it like animals. Put your head in and eat it like that. And in fact, in his memoir, Primo Levi describes the deprivation of spoons as an example of the unnecessary violence. Unnecessary violence motivated only by the specific intent to humiliate. So, and Levi also notes that after the liberation of Auschwitz camp, thousands of plastic spoons were found, in the warehouse, but they had never been given to the internees. So Giuseppe Di Porto explains. So the only way you could eat with a little bit of civilization was to make a spoon out of some piece of sheet metal. And those of us who worked in the shop and had access to work tools would sometimes take pieces of sheet metal and make spoons. I mean, not like real spoons, but at least you could, take the soup and eat it. This spoon would cost you a ration of bread. And we all paid this ration of bread for a spoon. So Mario asked him, would you do me a favor? Will you buy me a spoon? Because I can't eat without it. And he says, Mario, of course I will. I'll look for it. And Mario says, look, you buy the spoon with your bread ration, and then, when you bring me the spoon, I'll give you mine. So I had already eaten, he says, my bread ration, so I had nothing to buy a spoon with. So I said, okay, I'll look for it, and maybe somehow I'll get you a spoon. By Mario, and I walked off toward my barracks. I walked like 20 meters, and suddenly I see something glittering on the ground. I touch it with my foot like this. I move it. It was a spoon. I take the spoon, I clean it good in a puddle of water, real good. And my first thought was, great, I found a ration of bread. I can take it to Mario and get his bread ration. But my conscience, I thought, I wouldn't be stealing this bread ration. I give him a spoon and he gives me a bread ration. I can take the spoon and I tell Mario, look, I got you the spoon, so give me your bread ration back. So I go back to him and I said, look, Mario, I found your spoon. And he says, what do I owe you? How much do you pay? And no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't bring myself to tell him I bought it with a ration of bread. No matter how hard I tried, I just couldn't say it. At last, Mario, you don't owe me anything. I found the spoon on the ground. So I got up and left. And I kept thinking, am I crazy? Have I lost my mind? How is it possible? Something is the matter with me. Because it's just not possible that I could give him. We are friends, yes, but we're not relatives. He's not my brother. Why did I have to give him this ration of bread to spoon? And for a few days, I had this thought in my mind. And then I realized, let's put it this way. I realized that it has not been me who did it. Because I didn't have the strength to speak and to say, I don't know. So much depends on a spoon that you find on the ground and you give away instead of exchanging it. So much depends on a piece of bread that it did not have the courage to ask for. Giuseppe Di Porto had seen the demoralization of the victims, and with the clarity with which the oppressed read the souls of the oppressors, had also seen the demoralization of the oppressors, of the tormentors. In another very short video interview that he did before mine, he says, he repeats, they wanted to demoralize the human being. They wanted the human beings to no longer exist. And in his conversation with me, he recalls how during the death march that he took from Auschwitz to Mauthausen and after the liberation of the Auschwitz camp, he could see in the eyes, he could look in the eyes of the Nazis who shot in cold blood those who fell to the ground because they could no longer go on. And their eyes were not human, he says. I still remember now, those were strange eyes, eyes of another color. It may be my vision that I was seeing this way, however. So the culmination of his demoralization comes when, in despair, he denies God in the very act of speaking to God. You don't exist. And what happens? That the fact that he has given away this spoon, he finally finds within himself that humanity, that everything around him was trying to destroy, the morality that was being demoralized. Perhaps he says it was really a miracle. It was not me speaking, he says. It's as if a mysterious force had blocked his voice and spoken instead. Or perhaps just the irrepressibility of the human soul, which is a classic theme, say, in American literature, where the hero does the right thing in spite of what his rational mind tells him, say Huckleberry Finn and Saving the Saved. So this episode, where he does the right thing in spite of himself, is a turning point, an epiphany that literally saves his life. Because he goes back to the episode twice in the same interview. He goes back to it later, and he's talking about something else. He's talking about his health, and when it turns out that some of the problems that he had were due to the fact that he had been carrying heavy stuff or pushing heavy wheelbarrows in Auschwitz. So there's something wrong with his shoulders, and he goes back to this, and he says again. He talks about he'd been talking about hunger. Now he's talking about work, and he says, he repeats the same formulas. How is it possible that you must cause a person to die that has done no evil? And I would say to God, you don't exist. He keeps going back to the fact that he doubted God, that he blamed God for what was happening. And then, but then he says, this thing of the spoon, that's his expression, la cosa del cucchiaio, the story of the spoon, gave him back his will to live. It changed his relationship with God, but he also canceled this suicidal impulse that he had been feeling because of the demoralization that he had felt. So he just alludes to the spoon thing, but then there is an important change. The first time he had been speaking of voice, it wasn't me speaking, and I had been thinking of glossolalia in the stories of American evangelicals, Pentecostalists, where they say the same thing. It's not me speaking; it's God speaking through me. The second time, so the first time is about voice. The second time is about will. It was not my will. And how many times I said, I'm going to throw myself down and put an end to my suffering, or I'm going to hurl myself against the high-tension wires. Then, fortunately, there was a time in which the will to survive just prevailed. I must live. I must tell everybody what I'm seeing, because nobody would believe it. It's not a dream I'm dreaming, not a nightmare, because you can talk about it, but you don't understand it unless you live it, unless you see people die like that, like stray dogs, like infected animals. And you ask yourself, how is it possible that you kill a person that has never done you any harm? And then you see these people in tears, desperate, because they say, I can't carry this wheelbarrow, it's so heavy. And I would tell him, and here comes the fact that he knows how to use a shovel. And I would tell him, go slow. You must look like you're moving. You must never be seen standing still, but you must walk slowly, don't run. And I'd say, but I've never used a shovel. And to hear this from people of a certain age, 30, 35 years old, who never knew a shovel, then you were saying, how can you cause a person to die that has never done any harm? This is a question he keeps returning on. Then I kept saying, seeing how these people were desperate, I would say, seeing such human wickedness, I kept saying, God does not exist. God cannot exist. God cannot exist because these people who had never harmed anybody are dying. They're made to die like this. So God doesn't exist. I was blaspheming. Then after the day that happened, the thing of the spoon, I changed. Because I realized that it was a will other than mine that made me do it. So the challenge to God and the will to live, to tell the story, are ubiquitous themes in survivors' accounts. Settimia Spizzichino, who was the only woman who returned from the first 1,022 people that were deported from Rome, said, I have rebelled against myself. I have rebelled against God. And I made a promise when I was in camp. I made a solemn promise to my first companions who were selected to die, and those who died of disease, of hardship. I rebelled. I said, Lord, save me. See, you deny God and you appeal to God in the same breath. God, save me, because I have to go back and tell the story. So, these are not identical stories, however. For Settimia, this was both reliance and rebellion in God. For Giuseppe Di Porto, the will to live returns when he reconciles with God and stops blaspheming. It was a will other than mine. He never says that the thing of the spoon restored his faith in God, although he hints at it. In 3 hours of conversation, there are no other references to religion. Even the word miracle that he used is used in a generic meaning, not in a religious meaning. But the spiritual dimension, whether it was a miracle from outside or some unknown impulse from inside, it lends an extraordinary power to this, seemingly very simple tale. So giving up that ration of bread that was life is the inverse of the bread that is blessed and consumed in ritual, but it has the same meaning. It is the absent bread that becomes holy and, in another way, gives life. All this, however, remains implicit. What he says explicitly is that the spoon thing restored his faith in himself, his will to live, and the will to tell the story. He is reconciled with God, with humanity, and the humanity which is represented by this almost unknown, Mario Piperno, that he gives his bread which is life to a stranger. He was not my relative, he was not my brother, he says. And of course it didn't occur to me to ask him, did you ever see Mario Piperno when you both came back? And he knows that he had been ill, but it was just that moment. It was just that moment. Yeah. So, and it's as if there were deportees that were being reduced to objects, to pieces, Stücke, the Germans called them. They could regain their own human will either by a higher intervention or perhaps just tapping into the inner resources of humanity that they didn't even know that they possessed. As if only now he retrieved the voice that he had been unable to pull out to demand that piece of bread. So, this is the core of the story. And he tells it twice in the same interview, and then he concludes more or less in terms of the key words around which the story hinges: bread, work, and human being. He says, this was, say, the struggle that I waged so that I could tell my children, you must not suffer what I suffered. And I tell my children, look, I may be a non-human being. That is, I didn't know any childhood or any youth, because in order to do what I did, I worked from morning until night and came back. Including Sundays. I never knew Sundays until I was 40. I never knew a vacation until I was 45. This was so that I could one day be able to say, today I can eat a piece of bread in peace, a piece of bread that I earned with my labor, with my sacrifices, and by the sweat of my brow. So this is Giuseppe Di Porto's story. Now, it so happened that on January 27th, which in Europe is the day of remembrance on the Shoah, I played at the House of Memory and History in Rome a podcast that I made with the stories. And in the audience, there was my colleague and friend, Michaela Procaccia, who's a historian, possibly the finest historian and archivist in the Jewish community in Rome. And she recalled she had worked on the Italian interviews from Steven Spielberg's Shoah collection in Los Angeles, and she had worked on an earlier interview with Giuseppe Di Porto. That was collected for the Shoah Foundation 10 years before. In that interview, Giuseppe Di Porto does not mention the spoon, the story of the spoon, which is the crucial episode in his life story, and he does not mention it. There are two other interviews, brief interviews that he does for a TV station in Rome, 10 minutes, and of course he never mentions this. On the other, so how come he does not mention the most important episode in his life in this very extensive, like 3 hours interview for the Shoah Foundation on video? It has nothing to do with the quality of the interviewer. In fact, the person that did the interview for the Shoah Foundation is a well-trained, brilliant Jewish cultural organizer. And in fact, she knew about him a lot of things that I didn't know, because I went into the interview not knowing anything, which is my favorite approach, which I would not suggest, but it helps. In fact, there's another major omission in both interviews. His own sister, Celeste Di Porto, was the most famous or infamous collaborator. She sold a number of people to the Nazis during the Nazi occupation. The interviewer for the Shoah Foundation knew about it, didn't ask because this was not what she was after. I didn't know because, the Di Porto surname is so common that it didn't occur to me to make the connection. But so that's one omission. The other omission well, you can understand why he doesn't talk about his sister. But why didn't he talk about the spoon, about bread? And so, together with Michaela, she's the co-author of this part of the conversation. We compared the interviews. The first thing that Michaela noticed was the language. In the interview, he's talking to a Jewish interviewer in the first interview, and he's talking to a non-Jewish interviewer in the second interview. However, when he talks to me, he uses a lot of expressions taken from this very eloquent Jewish Roman dialect, which he does not use in the Shoah interview. And also, the language is a lot more familiar, even though he's talking to a stranger. I mean, all he knows is, I am his niece's teacher of American literature. And also the chronology is different, because the Shoah Foundation interview is much more structured. There's a guideline to questions and things. Mine, I'm just, my question was, just tell me about yourselves. And this is this is the point where I think this becomes methodologically interesting, because it has to do with the difference between testimony and story. In a testimony, you speak about something you've seen. In story, you speak about yourself. And so when talking to the Shoah Foundation, the purpose of those interviews was to prove that the Shoah really existed. So they were really factual. In my case, of course, that was not the point at all. The question was, what was the meaning for that person? And I didn't even frame it that way. I was just there, ready to listen. And so that he is much more aware that when he's interviewed, that he's giving a public statement. That he's speaking for history, and therefore his language is a lot more controlled, his chronology is a lot more controlled, and somehow the story is not about Giuseppe Di Porto, the story is about Shoah. In that interview, his story is one of the thousands that will go into the collective narrative of the Shoah. When he talks to me, his story is about himself. And one of the differences is that in the Shoah Foundation interview, he talks about how cold it was. To me, he talks about how hungry it was. And I think that the shift from cold to hunger has to do with the holy meaning, the spiritual meaning of that piece of bread. So that he has to insist on the importance of hunger so that I can understand what a piece of bread meant. You know? And so, and this, of course, also has to do with the meaning of memory. If memory is a relationship between two moments in time, the moment in which events took place and the moment in which they're being remembered and narrated, then of course the fact that there are 10 years go by between those two interviews means that he has probably been thinking about it and trying to make sense of his experience. You know? One interesting small minor difference is in both interviews he talks about when his father managed to get a cart that he carried around selling fruit or whatever he could remember. In my interviews he adds, just like the third world immigrants do today. So that makes, that connection between being discriminated for being Jewish in 1938, and being discriminated from being an immigrant today is a connection that it did not make 10 years before. So he's been thinking about it. Then, so that something else that I found interesting was, of course, his I'm not making quality judgments. I think both forms of the interview are necessary, okay? Because both give us valuable information. Of course, the Shoah Foundation interview is on video, and he's talking on video. You talk to the camera. You don't talk to the person that's interviewing you. All those of us who've ever been interviewed on television know this. Don't talk to me, talk to the camera. So it becomes relatively more impersonal. And so and perhaps the fact that the interviewer is Jewish and that I'm not causes him to make an extra effort to make me understand what it looked like. The difference between the interviewer and the interviewee is a challenge for the interviewee to dig deeper into the meaning of the experience, to make an extra effort to explain. The proxemics are also interesting because the Shoah Foundation interview is faced to the camera. And one point that most of those interviews share is that they try to present the person in the best, most prosperous environment possible. They're all somehow success narratives. They've survived, they've made it. So he is in this lovely middle-class parlor with... In my interview, of course, it was just audio. So a number of some information like gestures, facial expressions are lost. But I remember that we were almost it was some kind of semi-darkness. And we were not sitting face to face. Since then I discovered that I tend not to sit in front of the person, but like in a corner. He was sitting here and I was sitting here. It was not an interrogation. He was not, so this tells us a number of things about interviewing memory, history, subjectivity. Basically, the change between an interview that is meant to give a testimony about events and a narrative, a story that is a testimony about feelings, about subjectivity. And I believe that oral history is precious from both points of view. It tells us a lot of things that have happened. I'm thinking of Judith Babayan interviews in Monticello that changed some of the reconstructions of the events. But what oral history interview tells us much more in depth. It's never a yes-no. It's always a more or less relationship. Is about the intangible things that were happening in the person's soul and mind and hearts. And so that are we doing the interview because we're constructing sort of a quilt, a mosaic, of many stories to reconstruct the physical, the material form of a tragic event, or are we doing the interviews to find out what are the traces that this left in people's souls? And so the point is, of course, I would not have been able to ask these questions unless Michela Di Porto had not, Michaela Procaccia had not dug up the Shoah Foundation interview, and we could compare it. And it's in the difference that I just realized that I'm quoting Emily Dickinson, which I hadn't thought about. It's a difference where the meanings lie. Thank you.
Did you have a chance or feel motivated to ask about his wife?
She refused to talk about it. She didn't tell him any. And one thing I've learned is when people tell you that some things should not be talked about, you don't ask. Somehow you respect the silences. Because I guess the silences are often much more eloquent and full of meaning than anything that a person could actually put into words. The fact that what happened to this woman was unspeakable, even to her husband, who shared the experience, tells you a lot more about the impact of that experience than anything that she could have put into words. And then I guess it's just a matter of the key, the basic technique in oral history interviewing, which is respect. And if someone doesn't want to talk, you don't ask. That's the information you get. She died before him. And she never, not even to the Shoah Foundation interview, she never spoke.
Yes, sometimes. I'll do the same.
much. I'm just reflecting on the symbolic sharing that you were privileged to listen to. Do you think your presence was a catalyst for memory? Or had he rehearsed these memories? Or had these thoughts prior to the interview with you?
Well, basically my presence was, I wasn't asking questions. I went back over the interview and the transcripts. I practically asked no questions. I'm just there to listen. There are, in my whole experience of interviewer, there are basically only 2 interviews in which I asked no questions. One is with a student of mine who was at the events in Genoa 2001 during the G8 protests when the young people were massacred by the police and one of them was killed. And she just talked for 45 minutes and I asked no questions. And the other is with Piero Terracina, who is the storyteller about the Shoah in Rome, who was. And I just sit there and listen. And perhaps I think, there are 2 polarities in the interview. One in which you ask a number of questions because you want to know about things. And the other is in which you just open up a space and say, okay, tell me. In this particular interview, the accent was very much on the second side. I was just actually, because I wasn't going to ask him details about Auschwitz. I had done other interviews. I read a number of books, and I also always found that some questions are very intrusive. Some of the most important information in these narratives, not only those, but most trauma narratives, are about the silences. And you don't ask. Piero Terracina, who was actually the voice of the community of the survivors in Rome for years and years, when I talked to him, he talks about how he was arrested with his father and brothers, brought to the jail. They were placed against the wall, hands up against the wall, and forbidden to speak. But then he says, my father managed to whisper a few words to us. And he said, no matter what happens, never lose your dignity. Then there's a pause, and then Piero says, this, however, proved impossible. So what do? Do you ask him, how did you lose your dignity? Or do you just take it and wait for him to go on? And of course, that was my choice. Perhaps the gift that we have from the 1,000 interviews in the OHA Foundation is that they go into those details. And Giuseppe Di Porto gives us a few hints when he talks about, father stealing bread from brother, stealing bread from brother, father from son, and demoralizing, and eating that piece of molded bread with big droppings on it. So he does give you a few. Perhaps because I didn't ask. Sometimes just not asking, but saying, just signaling that you're willing to listen, that you're accepting the narrative, will help people bring up things that they might not say if you ask for them. I don't know. But in this case, and in most cases of this kind of interviews that I've done, I've done maybe just about 10 interviews with Shoah survivors. It's not one of my fields of research, but always I found myself always on the listening side. It's like, when you play football, what you call an assist. Here I am, do whatever. Here's a ball, do whatever you want with it. And I've often felt like that, just because one of the things that are said, the things that are incorrect that are said about oral history is that we give voice to the voiceless. Well, if they didn't have a voice, we wouldn't be able to write a word. What we do is we give a listening to people whose voice goes unheard. And in that case, what I was doing is, maybe I'm here to listen, just tell me whatever you want. Incidentally, most of the other details in the story are the same in both interviews. His father, his cart, and the details of the death march and what he did after he came back to Rome. Because of his sister and because of other things, he was not, he had a very complicated relationship with the Jewish community. And the fact that I was not a member of it might have helped him open up a little bit more about his doubts, his doubting God, which he does not mention in the other interviews.
Sandro, thank you so much for that absolutely inspiring and thought-provoking talk. Siobhan McHugh here. I just wanted to ask you about that quote you ended with, which picks up on something you've written about, where you said it's the difference where the meanings lie. And you have written about what you call the line of difference. I think it was when you were interviewing a woman in Kentucky who you realised was the granddaughter of an enslaved person, a black woman. And you write eloquently about how can she trust me? I'm a white, middle-aged, Italian man. And you reflect on that, and you basically, in that book, you suggest that exactly this, that it's about recognising the difference and acting from the understanding of difference that you get new meaning. And just today, there's a lot of debate around, say, interviewing people who are Indigenous or people who might be from the queer community, and this insider-outsider debate. Should only people from that community interview people of that community? And I have certain views on that, but I would be really interested to know what you think of the merits of the insider interviewing insiders or the outsider insider. What are the pros and cons? If you could just expand on that, please.
So the inside versus outsider interview. Okay, I have a little formula, which is what makes the interview possible is what you have in common. What makes it interesting is what you don't have in common. So what made this interview possible? The fact that this person's niece knew that more or less I had my heart was on the right side, that I had an experience doing interviews, that I was interested, and of course that we had a language in common. What made it interesting was that he had been in Auschwitz and I hadn't, basically. So the effort in in this case was that he had to convey the meaning and the impact of that experience rather than supply the details about, about the ways in which it happened. Because he was talking to somebody who didn't know anything about it. Not just in terms of fact, because in terms of facts I did know, but in terms of meaning. And I always thought that the interview is really about the difference. And one of the things that make this interview different from those of the Shoah Foundation, which I repeat are brilliant and precious, is precisely that they're insider interviews. When they called for interviewers in Rome, I asked a couple of my students that I had trained in oral history to apply, but they were not Jewish and they were not taken. The assumption was all the interviewers had to be Jewish because somehow they knew more, which is true. But somehow the kind of challenge that you get from talking to a stranger is entirely different. We've all tried to interview our parents, for instance. I think my interviews with my father are the worst interviews I ever did in my life. Because, you ask him a question, he said, you already know the answer. It's not an interview, it's an interrogation. One small interviewing technique that I never ask a question if you know the answer. So the fact that I didn't know that I was a stranger, like interviewing black people, African Americans. They're some of the interviews in which my own identity. Can I just make a detour and tell you a little story? I had been teaching African American authors all my life, but back in the 70s, early 80s, there were no black people in Rome. We had, the mass immigration from the third world began in the mid-80s. So that I had no experience that. When I went to Kentucky, I finally had the opportunity to do my first interviews with African Americans in the mining communities in Harlem. And this lady, it's a long story about the interview, I won't go into it, but this lady started telling the story. You know the song Twist and Shout, or Ravel's Bolero, where you repeat the same phrase but the pitch goes higher and higher? That's the way she did the interview. She started, again, I was there to interview her husband, not her. So when she seized the floor, she spoke for 2 hours, and I didn't ask any questions. Some of the greatest interviews are like that, when people just felt compelled to speak. And so she starts by telling me blacks and whites together, and then she says, well, actually, and I'll tell you, we weren't so happy about this integration, because they sent all the kids to white schools and they fired all the black teachers, which had never occurred to me. And then, and she goes, she becomes more problematic every time she goes around, and the signal phrase is, and I'll tell you. And then she goes at one point and she says, and I'll tell you. No white person has ever done anything to me personally, but because of what my grandparents, or my great-grandparents were slaves, she had a hard time uttering the word slaves, but she finally does. And because of the stories I heard that were transmitted from them, because you're white, I don't trust you. So the question is, She doesn't trust white people in general, or she doesn't trust Alessandro Portelli in person. And it's always much more productive to assume that why should she trust me? She's black and white. She's a woman and a man. She's working class and middle class. She is she's a Baptist, a very religious Baptist. I'm a lapsed Catholic, and they're all, and she says there's always going to be a space between us. So why should she trust me? And the question was, had I been, because I had been doing this Shoah Foundation, Shoah interviews, more or less, and the question to me was, of course I'm I've been introduced by, I don't know if you know who Guy Carawan was. Guy Carawan is a person that taught all of us the song We Shall Overcome, and he introduced me to her, so she knows which side I'm on. But the moment the color of your skin becomes a matter of life and death, can she trust me? Or can I trust myself to do the right thing? What would I have done in 1938 if my schoolmates suddenly disappeared because they were Jewish? Would I have said anything? I don't know. It's easy now. But can I trust myself? And then, so the interview is a double challenge. The interviewee is challenged to interrogate herself about the structure of her life story, because nobody ever asked you, tell me a story of your life. So this is a challenge. But then you're being challenged by the encounter with otherness. So, and then she goes on after this, and she goes on for another hour, and she talks about, and I'll tell you, she raises the stakes, and she talks about miscegenation, about sexual, white-black sexual relationships, very complicated things. And then the question is, okay, if she can't trust me, why is she talking to me? And then I went back and we did another interview. And basically what she's doing is she's talking to me because she trusts me enough to be able to explain to me why she cannot trust me. Okay? And this is the structure of these interviews. Okay? And she has this incredible expression where she says, there's always going to be a line. My grandmother always tells you, no matter how good white people talk, no matter how good they act, there's always going to be a line. So what she's doing, she's talking across the line, which, thanks to my classical high school education, I know is the actual meaning of the word dialogue, because dialogue means speaking across. So you can have a dialogue only if there's a line. Only if there's a line. Only if there's a difference. In this case, it was more of a monologue, but but in orality, in oral discourse, there's no such thing as a monologue, because the proxemics, the body language, the facial expression, the silences of the person you're talking to are part of the conversation. So it's always a dialogue, even if only one person actually speaks. So in this case, it was a dialogue in that sense. He was speaking across that line that separates all those who have been to Auschwitz from those who haven't. And a line which is somehow easier to perceive when you're talking to someone who is outside your own community. He was, and the way in which he was able to speak across that line was that he was also speaking, looking inward about who he was, and this combination of self-interrogation and listening created this unforgettable experience.
We've got lots of questions. We've got 10 minutes, so can you please keep and breathe in order? Rod, Di first, go Rod, and then go. If there's anyone else who might have time.
Thank you very much, Alessandro. That was a beautiful speech. I was one of the interviewers for the Shoah. Steven Spielberg did 52,000 interviews for the Shoah all over the world in many different languages. It was very structured, and we were told to ask about their life before the Shoah to show what had been destroyed and also what it was like for them as they went through it. But as you said, it was something to do with we survived, because at the end of each interview, the people's family came and sat with them. And it was just wonderful. And that sort of was it to say, we are continuing. But we were given questions, and I felt like I was taking evidence. And I was not crying. I am a crying person, but I didn't cry then. But when they started talking about coming home, that was when I cried. But we were asked not to speak about their life afterwards, which was very hard. But that was the structure of those interviews, and they were really wonderful.
You know, he frames the whole interview is actually framed in both cases, both interviews are actually framed about episodes in which he's on the verge of death. The first thing he says in my interview, but also, you know, one of the differences is in my interview is a lot less chronological. He comes and goes. But in both cases, he starts with when he was 2 years old, and the doctor said he was going to die, and then he was saved. And then in both interviews, he talks about when he was coming home on the train, and he was leaning on the door of the coach, and the door suddenly opened, and he was blown outside, and he was hanging on the door, and finally managed to get back in. So, you know, those two episodes frame the story into the fact that the whole struggle was to stay alive, and staying alive was both physical and spiritual, and the physical had to do with the shovel, and the spiritual had to do with the bread, even though the bread was also physical. And incidentally, the title I gave to the stock, Pane e Lavoro, was the slogan of the Italian Communist Party in 1948. Those were the basic demands in 1948. We want bread, we want jobs. And that's what he's talking about. He was able, he was able to survive because he knew how to use a shovel. Now, one of the fascinating things that I learned doing interviews with coal miners and steel workers is that no matter how unskilled you are, whether your job actually consists in pick and shovel, you have to know how to use a shovel. There is knowledge even in the least skilled kind of labor, because if you don't know how to use a shovel, you won't last. So one of the things that these stories question is the separation between intellectual and manual work. There's an intellectual, there's knowledge implicit even in the most manual kind of work. And this is one of the things that he talks about, that he learned to work, again, both the work ethics that he got from his father and the knowing how to use a shovel that he had to learn when he was forced to do it, and that helped him survive the hard work at Monowitz. So this is about the different and converging forms of survival, physical and spiritual. And and because the person is both, And then finally, one of the things that you learn by doing oral history is that the human person cannot be split into different disciplinary elements. You have to deal with the person as a whole.
Alessandro, thank you very much for your talk. My name is Rod Friedman. I was interested when you said you went into this interview with Giuseppe you didn't know anything about him, but that you wouldn't recommend of approaching an interview. So, which do you lean towards, going into an interview knowing as little as possible and being open to whatever shows up, or do you feel it's better to do preparation and research intensively before an interview? Thank you.
Well, when you talk about oral history, you have actually two elements. One is the history and the other is the oral. And it really depends on whether your accents, you stress one or the other. If you stress history, then you're apt to trying to reconstruct the events. And this is essential. If you stress the oral, you're trying to reconstruct the ways in which the events become memory and language. Now, because I don't come from history, but I come from literature, my interest is more toward, the verbal construct of the remembered experience and its meaning. Of course, in order to work on the verbal construct, on the oral, you also had to know the history. Like, I know Al was mentioning my book on the death of Luigi Trastulli, which is a classic wrong narrative. And you get all the meaning of the story because it's wrong, but the only way you know it's wrong is because you know the history. So you have to work both ways. Because I'm interested more in the, let's call it subjective, I prefer the oral history interview to be my initial source of information. And therefore I do not go, partly because of course people will not tell you, will not talk to you if they think you already know what they're going to talk about. More or less, you have to know enough to be able to take in the new information, to be able to have a dialogue, maybe to ask correct questions if you do. But I prefer, just my preference, however, it's not normative or I don't necessarily recommend it. I prefer not to know much about the specific person, to know enough about the context so that I can take in the story and then verify and then check it with other sources. Go back to the archives, go back to the written literature. In this case, go back to the Shoah Foundation interview. But you do it afterwards because. Well, one interview I did with this man, but I was doing this project on the Nazi massacre in Rome, and I was also trying to interview fascists. And I interviewed this man, who's an acquaintance of my father-in-law, so what we had in common, that's why he accepted to talk to me. And he talked for a couple of hours. He did not mention, and I did not know, that he had been on trial for the killing of a young student in 1944 in Rome, which is a well-known episode in the history of the occupation. He didn't mention it. I didn't know. I didn't ask him. Then I went back to the records and I found out that he had... And what was the information I got from the first interview? The information I got was the silence, of course. Was the fact that he wouldn't talk about it. Because then I went back and I asked him, and he gave me his version, which is the same version that I could have got from the archives. But the interesting thing is, is the silence. And of course, silences are... la memoria es un sótano repleno de sentido. This is Borges. Memory is a cellar filled with meaning, you know, and the silence is the cellar, is what behind them. And so this is one of the reasons why I'm interested. I try to, go into the interview. I know this person worked in the coal mines. Tell me about it. And then I know this person was in Auschwitz. Tell me about it. But and then go back to the archive. Somehow you do the work of the historian. You try to reconstruct what happened. You do the work of the anthropologist. You try to reconstruct the cultural, the mental constructs that have been generated by the event. And then you do the work of the oral historian. You navigate no man's land between the event and the memory and try to make sense of how that event generated that memory.
Thanks.